Good morning and welcome back. This is part 3 of an in progress series on this mosaic titled I Heard the Mountains Sing. In part 2 I mentioned some rules that I'm breaking, and because I don't want to get a reputation as telling people to break rules, I thought I could elaborate a little bit on these rules. So I'm going to talk about 3 rules today. They are unofficial rules, not official rules. And you may have heard talk of them, or maybe not. I'm going to share my understanding of these rules and how I process these rules. So the first rule is avoid triangles. The second rule is, and it's related to the first rule, it's a way to avoid triangles, is sdoppio-mento. Use sdoppio-mento to flare your line, to increase the width of a line. And the third rule is don't use whole tiles, whole pieces of tile or smalty, and probably marble as well. So let's talk about the first rule, the triangles. As I explained in the video, I am breaking that rule because I'm using plenty of triangles. And the reason I'm using a lot of triangles is because I can shape nice triangles with the grinder, and I am using a grinder on this piece. The rule about triangles, I'm not sure how it got started, but if you study some old Roman mosaics, you might just see some triangles that stand out, that call attention to themselves. Triangles are challenging to cut. To cut a triangle to fit, the exact kind of triangle you need for a space, especially out of stone, is difficult. And so they did use triangles sparingly, generally in Roman mosaics, and they did employ sdoppio-mento to help avoid using triangles. But sometimes you just have to start with a triangle. And I've seen some Roman mosaics where a triangle does kind of stand out. Part of that is because it's not cut as perfectly to fit the triangle space, but also because it stands out in contrast to all the cubes, the stone cubes that are used in Roman mosaics. Triangles are interesting. I see triangles used a lot in beginner work, especially stained glass beginner work, or early work, I should say. Sometimes they're used in a pleasant way, and sometimes not. I think the appeal of triangles is that maybe, I don't think I ever used them that much when I worked with stained glass, but I'm guessing they're easy to cut, maybe in strips or whatever. I'm not sure, but I think they must be relatively easy to cut, especially being stained glass. And they're easy to fit together. You've always got a triangle space to fit that triangle into. There are many hazards, though, or maybe just a few, notorious hazards with relying a lot on triangles, because the way they fit together, they often create distracting patterns, either long lines that shouldn't be there, or other sub shapes within like a background of triangles. So sometimes they're used, okay, and other times not. And it's usually in early work, and it's easy to, it's just part of a process of learning. So triangles kind of have a bad reputation. And maybe some of that is appropriate. In this piece, I talked about how I'm using a lot of triangles, not using sdoppio-mento, which leads me to have to use triangles, but I'm using the grinder. So let's look at some of my triangles, because I don't think they stand out. In fact, I think they look nice. I think they look graceful, and they help define the area in a nice way. Let's look at these triangles here. So this is these 2 lines are the same material. So I just started with this line, and then that left me this space to fill, which I had to cut instead of doing a Sedopiamento, I had to cut this triangle. And the same down here. I got this line, then I've just got this little tiny space, and I had to cut these triangles, but which I couldn't really cut with hand tools, especially these. But I can shape them with a grinder, and they look nice, I think. Let's see, there's another case where I didn't use Sedopiamento, but I've got nicely shaped pieces because of the grinder. This line as well tapers down into very, very thin pieces, which I could only accomplish with a grinder. This one down here a little too. So on this piece, well, let's look at one more. I just finished this inside area here, and some of this soft gray marble is still a little wet from the thin set, absorbing that moisture. But again, I did a line up here, and then I came in with this lower line. Well, then I had to start here with triangles. And then I came with my second lower line, again, triangles. Then I'm left with this line, which I can only start with triangles, and which I can only shape with a grinder. But I think it looks fine, and I think that kind of flaring with all the triangles supports the shape there, the space that I'm filling. Even this one, where I started with a wider line here, and then had very narrow space to fill, but because of the grinder, I can shape those very, very narrow pieces. And I don't think they stand out. I don't think they call attention to themselves. And in fact, I think they add some visual interest. Now, you know what I don't like is the iPhone is really showing these pretty dark. And there is kind of an accidental conglomeration of dark pieces. So I might have to fix that. But we'll see. Okay, I got off subject. So that's triangles. For the reason of avoiding something that would call attention to itself, that would look clunky, I'm not concerned about that because I'm using the grinder. And then I had to decide, well, do I want to use Sedopiamento or not? And I chose not to. Let's look at this piece, which I finished last year. And I did use Sedopiamento on this, but that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do a more classical approach. And it made sense to flare this area instead of, for example, like I did on this piece, to flare it, to come in with, line up my, here we are, way over here, to flare it starting with triangles over here, to kind of wedge in a triangle to start a new line. I went from 1 into 2, and that is what Sedopiamento is. And here again, 1 into 2, 1 into 2. I had to do that a lot because I'm really growing that space. And it's a beautiful way to do it. And it was perfect for this piece. And it made sense. So I don't think there may be a couple triangles in here that were just maybe necessary, but I'm not sure there is. So I avoided triangles, and I used Sedopiamento. I wanted to really do this kind of more classical cutting and laying approach. This one, the Sedopiamento, to me didn't make a lot of sense. First of all, a key thing in these mosaics that I like to do, called layers, is pattern. It's a key part of this, the pattern of the different cuts of material. And because I don't have really large spaces and I'm varying the cuts so much, I just didn't think Sedopiamento made a lot of sense. I could have used it, but I chose not to, and I chose to instead follow the curves with the width of the piece, and then just fill in, you know, the spaces that resulted from that. Sedopiamento kind of controls that a whole lot more. Here, I think letting the widths of these pieces just follow my curves, which are defined by the porcelain. Also is part of what makes these mosaics interesting, is the lines that are created from not using Sdopiamento. Even though, you know, here there's lines created, and so maybe I could have achieved the same thing. But it's just really hard for me to get my head around, for one thing, with all these different cuts. And because I'm using the grinder, you know, I just think that those triangles actually are an asset, kind of add to the visual interest. Okay, so that's triangles and Sdopiamento. The third rule about not using whole tiles, I don't know exactly where that comes from. Whole smalty. I've done some large mosaics, and I've used whole smalty. Smalty is hand cut, so it's not quite as perfectly square as vitreous tile. A lot of people do use whole smalty. I just finished that red piece, Familial Wounds, and I used a lot of whole smalty on there. It's rather large, and I think it was fine. Maybe the biggest offender is something like vitreous, because it's machine made and obviously so square, and it can look a little grid-like, and maybe it does here, but it doesn't bother me. As I explained in part 2, I like this tile. It's got that, I only had a little bit of it. In fact, this is pretty much all I had. I won't be using it again on this piece. But you can see there's a orchid purple kind of streak in it, and in some tiles there wasn't very much. So I just wanted to use it as large as possible because I thought it was a very pretty tile. I tried not to let it be too monotonous. There's a little shaping in there and down here, but definitely you can see it's a square tile. I'm okay with that. Other mosaics I would not do that, just because it wasn't right for that mosaic. So the unofficial rule that I'm breaking or ignoring, it depends. It depends on the kind of mosaic you're making and what you're doing with it. I've tried to soften this as much as possible. I used kind of mixed some white and gray thinset to effectively grout that to soften it as much as possible, to soften the kind of grout lines, the grid-like structure of it. And it's not completely grid-like. There's some variation in size. So I felt okay about it for this mosaic. All right, that's the 3 rules. Avoid triangles, use Sdopiamento, and don't use whole tiles. Oh, well, actually, let me talk a little more. These are kind of whole tiles too, whole pieces of marble, as they come from, this was from Mosaic Rocks, but also from Di Mosaico, although theirs is much thicker and I generally can't use it whole. These are cubes, polished cubes that I bought from maybe Home Depot years ago. They're cut in half, so effectively they are kind of whole tiles, but they create a different shape. They are very rectangular. They're, you know, straight and perhaps a little gritty looking, but grid-y looking. But it's a nice variation of pattern. So I'm okay with it. Like this. This creates a nice variation of pattern from the smaller pieces of marble. One more thing. I am in my ignoring of rules with triangles and Sdopiamento. I'm using 2 different ways of shaping these spaces. This one here, I've kind of got this shape that I start with the single line, and then the next line, and then the next line, and then, you know, I'm just kind of from bottom to top, and then I end up with the most tapering there. The other approach, which I've used here, I've got the top line, then I do the bottom line, then the second top line, the second bottom line, And then I fill in the middle. Did that kind of down here too. The top line, I did the bottom, I did the next top line, and then I was left with that little space. So I'm doing them a couple different ways. Can't really explain why, but I think they both look interesting. Okay, this is about unofficial mosaic rules. Thank you for joining me, and let's get back to work. Until next time, ciao.